The war is over, the smoke clears, and a country tells itself a story it wants to believe, that something brutal has finally been cut out at the root, that 4 years of bloodshed have purchased something clean, something final, something that can be called freedom without hesitation, and everywhere the same idea begins to settle in, repeated in speeches, written into memory, taught as a turning point that divides everything into before and after. Because in 1865, the Confederacy collapses, the Union stands, and the 13th Amendment passes, declaring that slavery is abolished. And for millions of people who had lived their entire lives under ownership, that word carries weight that is impossible to ignore. It feels like a line has been crossed, like history has corrected itself, like a system that defined human beings as property has finally been destroyed, and that is how the moment is remembered, as closure, as resolution, as the end of one of the most violent systems in American history. But even inside that moment, even while the language of freedom spreads, something is already missing, because freedom arrives without land, without protection, without economic independence, without any real transfer of power. And that absence is not immediately obvious, because the word itself is so strong, it fills the space. It creates the feeling that something complete has happened, when in reality, what has happened is only partial, only legal, only one layer of a much larger structure that has not been dismantled. And the country begins to compress this moment into a symbol, a clean ending that can be pointed to, celebrated, and moved past, because it is easier to believe that something this large can end in a single year than to confront what it would actually take to undo it completely. And that is the illusion this moment creates. Not a lie exactly, but a version of the truth that feels finished when it is not, because beneath the celebration, beneath the language, beneath the relief, the system that depended on black labor has not disappeared, it has been disrupted. And disruption is not the same as destruction, because the demand for labor still exists, the structures of power still exist, the people who benefited from that system are still in place. And the question that begins to form, quietly at first, but impossible to ignore once it surfaces, is simple and dangerous at the same time. If slavery truly ended here, why does control over black labor begin to reappear almost immediately in new forms that look different, but function in ways that feel disturbingly familiar? And that question is not answered in the celebration. It is buried under it, because the story sounds finished in 1865. But the law itself, the very amendment that is supposed to close this chapter, contains something that keeps the door open. Because inside the same amendment that abolishes slavery, inside the very sentence that declares its end, there is a condition, a phrase that changes everything. Once you slow down enough to see it, slavery and involuntary servitude are abolished, except as punishment for crime. And that exception does not look like much at first. It reads like a technical detail, something secondary, something that does not carry the weight of the larger statement, but in reality, it becomes the hinge that the entire post-war system will turn on, because what has just happened is not the absolute destruction of forced labor. It is its redefinition, its relocation, its transfer from private ownership into something the state can now legally control. And that difference matters more than it appears, because before 1865, enslaved people were owned by individuals, bought and sold as property. But after 1865, the law creates a pathway where forced labor can still exist, not through ownership, but through punishment, and that means the system has not lost its core function. It has lost its original form, and once that becomes clear, the entire narrative begins to shift, because now the question is no longer whether slavery ended. It becomes who has the authority to control labor, who can legally compel it, who can decide when freedom is removed and under what conditions. And in a region like the post-war South, where the economy had depended almost entirely on unpaid black labor, where plantations still needed workers, where elites still needed control. This clause is not abstract, it is opportunity. opportunity. It is a legal mechanism waiting to be used, because if forced labor can still exist through criminal punishment, then the only thing required to sustain it is a system that produces criminals. And that is where the transformation begins. Not through a return to the old system, but through the creation of a new one that operates under the language of law. Because once freedom can be taken away through criminalization, the next step becomes inevitable. Freedom itself has to be redefined in a way that makes it easier to remove. Freedom does not collapse all at once. It gets redirected, narrowed, redefined until it begins to function less like a reality and more like a condition that can be taken away at any moment. And in the years immediately after 1865, that process begins almost instantly, not through open declarations that slavery should return, but through laws that quietly reshape what it means to be free. Because if forced labor can still exist as punishment for crime, then the system does not need to rebuild slavery directly. It only needs to decide what counts as a crime. And in the post-war South, that decision is not random. It follows a clear pattern, one that targets the exact conditions newly freed people are forced into the moment emancipation arrives. Men who had just been released from bondage now have no land, no wages saved, no infrastructure to support independent survival. And almost immediately, laws begin to appear that make those conditions illegal, vagrancy laws that define unemployment as a crime, loitering laws that make movement without clear purpose punishable, labor contract laws that force individuals into agreements they cannot realistically refuse, curfews that restrict presence in public space. And each of these laws does something subtle but powerful. It takes normal acts of survival and reframes them as violations, so that simply existing without employment, moving without permission, or refusing a contract becomes grounds for arrest. And this is where the system reveals how precise it is. Because it does not criminalize everyone equally, it is enforced selectively, overwhelmingly against black men, creating a pattern where freedom exists in theory but becomes dangerous in practice. Because at any moment it can be interpreted as non-compliance. And once that interpretation is made, the process is already in motion. An arrest is made, a charge is filed, a fine is issued, and for people who have no money, no resources, no protection within the legal system, that fine becomes a trap. Because inability to pay leads to further punishment, further confinement, further loss of freedom that had only just been granted. What makes this system so effective is that it does not rely on spectacle. It does not need chains in the open or auctions in the square. It operates through paperwork, through warrants, through local courts that process individuals quickly and repeatedly, feeding a system that now depends on a steady supply of arrested bodies, and that supply is not incidental. It is produced, structured through law and enforcement so that it continues without interruption. Because the goal is no longer to own people outright, it is to control their movement, their labor, their options, and to ensure that control can always be justified within the framework of legality. Sheriffs, judges, local officials, and employers become interconnected parts of this mechanism, not always through formal coordination, but through shared interest, because the same system that criminalizes black life also creates opportunities for labor extraction. And that connection begins to tighten as more arrests lead to more prisoners, and more prisoners create a new kind of workforce that can be directed, used, and replaced without the language of ownership ever needing to return. This is the moment where the meaning of freedom shifts most dramatically, because it becomes conditional, something that exists only as long as it is not interrupted by accusation, by enforcement, by a system that has been designed to find reasons to remove it. And once that condition is in place, the structure is complete, because now the law can take a free person and turn them into a criminal. And once they are a criminal, the law can take their labor again, legally, systematically, and profitably. And that is the realization that begins to settle in beneath everything everything else. That the system did not need to rebuild slavery as it was. It only needed to redefine the path into it, and once that path exists, the question that follows is no longer theoretical. It becomes immediate and unavoidable. When these arrests happen, when these men are taken into custody, where do they go? And more importantly, who is waiting to use them? The answer appears almost immediately, and when it does, it doesn't announce itself as a return to anything old. It presents itself as something new, something administrative, something that sounds like policy rather than power. Because once the state begins arresting large numbers of black men under these laws, it is suddenly faced with a different kind of problem: what to do with them, how to house them, how to manage them, how to pay for the growing prison population. And the solution that emerges is not to absorb that cost, but to turn it into profit, to convert prisoners into a resource that can be leased out to private companies. And in that moment, the system completes its transformation, because now the state does not just punish, it supplies labor. Convict leasing takes people who have been processed through the legal system and hands them over to plantations, mines, railroads, lumber camps, industrial work sites, anywhere labor is needed and can be exploited. And these companies do not buy these workers. They rent them, which changes the relationship in a way that is more devastating than it first appears, because ownership once came with a financial incentive to preserve life, but leasing removes that incentive. It replaces it with something colder, something more disposable, because if a worker dies, another can be sent, another arrest can be made, another body can be supplied, and that constant replacement turns human beings into a flow rather than an investment. States begin to depend on this system as a source of revenue, collecting fees from the companies that lease prisoners, integrating this practice into their financial structure so that incarceration itself becomes economically valuable. And the more arrests that occur, the more labor becomes available, and the more labor becomes available, the more profitable the system becomes, creating a feedback loop where enforcement, imprisonment, and labor extraction reinforce each other without ever needing to call themselves slavery. On the ground, the conditions are brutal, often worse than what existed before emancipation, because there is no pretense of long-term care, no expectation that the worker will survive beyond the immediate task. And in places like mines and camps, the combination of overwork, malnutrition, disease, and physical abuse creates mortality rates that are staggering. Men worked until they collapse, bodies replaced without pause, records kept not to protect, but to account, to track output, to measure value, extracted from lives that are no longer legally owned but are still fully controlled. What makes this system so difficult to confront is how openly it operates within the law, how it does not hide itself as an illegal practice, but functions as an accepted part of the post-war order, because the same amendment that abolished slavery allows this to exist. The same courts that process arrests enable this supply. The same state that claims to enforce justice becomes the broker of labor, and that shift is what defines this moment, not a return to the past, but an evolution of it, a movement from property slavery to penal slavery, where the form changes, but the function remains. And this is where the illusion finally breaks, because the idea that forced labor ended in 1865 cannot survive contact with what is happening here, where men who were legally free are being taken, processed, and sent into conditions that strip them of autonomy, extract their labor, and often end their lives, all under the authority of the law, all within a system that presents itself as legitimate. And once that becomes clear, another layer of the system begins to reveal itself, because not everyone is captured through arrest, not everyone enters through the prison, but control does not stop at the prison gate. It extends outward into the fields, into the contracts, into the economic structures that define what freedom looks like for those who are never arrested, but are never truly free either. Not everyone is taken through a jail cell. Not everyone is forced into labor through a sentence, but that does not mean they escape the system, because outside the prison walls, another structure is already forming, quieter, less visible, but just as effective at keeping control in place, and it begins with a simple reality that shapes everything after 1865. Freedom arrives without land, without capital, without any material foundation to build independence on, and in that vacuum, the only option for many formerly enslaved people is to return to the same land they once worked, now under a different name, a different agreement, a different structure that presents itself as contractual rather than coercive, but functions in ways that are deeply familiar. Sharecropping emerges as the dominant system, a labor arrangement where families work plots of land owned by white planters in exchange for a portion of the crop, and on the surface it appears to be a step toward independence. No longer owned, no longer bought or sold, now working under an agreement. But the reality is shaped by conditions that make that agreement almost impossible to escape, because the tools, the seeds, the housing, even the food needed to survive until harvest are all provided on credit, and that credit is controlled by the same landowners or associated merchants, who also control the accounting. At the end of each season, when the crop is harvested and the numbers are calculated, the system reveals its true nature. Because the sharecropper rarely comes out ahead, debts accumulate instead of disappearing. Balances are adjusted in ways that are difficult to challenge, and what should be a cycle of earning becomes a cycle of owing, where each year begins already tied to the last, and leaving the land becomes nearly impossible, because departure would mean abandoning not just the crop, but the debt attached to it, a debt that can be enforced, extended, and used as leverage to keep labor in place. This is where control takes on a different form, not enforced through chains or guards, but through dependency, through the absence of alternatives, through a system that limits movement not by physical restraint, but by economic reality. Because when survival depends on access to land, tools, and credit that are all controlled by the same group, freedom becomes conditional again, not removed outright, but shaped into something narrow, something that exists within boundaries set by those who still hold power. And this system does not operate in isolation. It exists alongside the criminal system, reinforcing it, because failure within the economic structure can lead back into the legal one. Unpaid debts, disputes, accusations can become grounds for arrest, feeding the same pipeline that leads into convict leasing, while those who remain outside prison continue to labor under conditions that limit their ability to ever become independent, creating two tracks that serve the same purpose, one through punishment, one through economics, both maintaining control over black labor in a world that claims that control no longer exists. What makes this system so effective is how ordinary it appears, how it blends into the landscape, into the idea of agriculture, of contracts, of work, without the visible markers of the system that came before, and that normalcy allows it to persist, to spread, to define entire regions for generations, because it does not need to announce itself as coercion. It only needs to function as it always has, keeping people tied to land they do not own, bound to debts they cannot clear, operating within a structure that ensures that while slavery may have ended in name, the conditions that made it profitable have been carefully preserved. By the time you step back and look at the full picture, what ended in 1865 begins to feel smaller than what continued, because slavery as a legal category disappears. The language changes, the auctions stop, the ownership papers vanish. But the system that made all of that possible does not collapse with it. It reorganizes, it spreads across new institutions, it divides itself into parts that are easier to justify, easier to maintain, and harder to recognize as a continuation of the same structure. Violence does not disappear either. It changes its role, becoming less about maintaining a formal system of ownership and more about enforcing the boundaries of a new one, because groups like the Ku Klux Klan, local militias, and mobs operate as a constant threat. A reminder that stepping outside the limits imposed by the system can carry immediate consequences, and that violence is not separate from the economic and legal structures. It supports them, reinforces them, ensures that resistance is met with punishment that extends beyond the courtroom. At the same time, institutions begin to normalize what is happening. Courts process cases as if they are routine. Law enforcement enforces laws that are written to appear neutral. Economic systems present themselves as contracts and agreements rather than constraints. And the country as a whole begins to move forward with a narrative of progress, focusing on the fact that slavery has ended while largely ignoring the ways in which its logic continues to operate beneath the surface. Because what actually survives is not one specific form, it is the principle that defined the system from the beginning: control over black labor, control over movement, control over the conditions of survival, and that control proves to be adaptable, capable of shifting from ownership to criminalization, from criminalization to leasing, from leasing to debt, from debt to long-term economic dependency. Each form replacing the last while preserving the same underlying function. And that adaptability is what makes the system so enduring, because it does not depend on being called slavery. It depends on being able to extract labor, limit autonomy, and concentrate power. And as long as those elements remain in place, the system can survive under different names, inside different structures, across different periods of time, evolving in response to pressure rather than collapsing under it. This is why the story cannot end in 1865, because the machinery that slavery built does not shut down. It keeps moving, entering prisons, entering contracts, entering financial systems, embedding itself into the broader structure of American life in ways that make it less visible but no less real, and over time those patterns continue to develop, feeding into later systems: chain gangs, prison farms, racialized policing, mass incarceration, each one carrying forward elements of the same logic that began long before emancipation was declared. And when everything is pulled together, when the celebration, the clause, the criminalization, the forced labor, the economic control, and the violence are all placed in the same frame, the conclusion becomes impossible to avoid. 1865 did end slavery as a name. It ended ownership in its most visible form, but it did not end the system that slavery created, because that system was never just about ownership. It was about control, and control did not die. It adapted, it found new language, new institutions, new justifications, and it kept going, long after the moment that was supposed to mark its end.